So what we're going to talk about, they asked me to talk about Vatican and Curial communication. It's kind of a very, very broad topic because you have different perspectives you can take. So as customary, I didn't ask anything because I wanted to be free to do that. And I want to tell you something. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. Yeah, it does work. And should I pause it? So I want to talk to you about a little, first of all, about what is a Vaticanista. We used to call ourselves Vaticanisti because there is a history. You see that guy over there? That's one of the few pictures we have. That guy is Ben Eli. Ben Eli was born in 1925, and he started to work as a journalist right after the Second World War. Ben Eli was not a Catholic, was totally agnostic in the beginning, coming from a family of agnostic people generally, but he wanted to work. And then after the war, there was some interest for journalists. He was only one of the few people who was able to interview Evita Peron when Evita Peron was in Italy. I actually heard the recording of that. So when his newspaper, that was a small newspaper in Italy called Il Resto del Carlino, asked him to cover the Vatican. And so he was like walking around the St. Peter Square, trying to understand what was it. And he met this kind of friar, a Franciscan friar with a long beard. And this friar went to him and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm trying to understand what is the Vatican." And this guy said, yeah, who knows what is the Vatican? So this guy was Father Damaso. Father Damaso was the secretary of Cardinal Giuseppe Siri. Cardinal Giuseppe Siri has been the Archbishop of Genoa for more than 40 years and also president of the Italian Bishops' Conference. So far, that friar became one of Ben Eli's best friends, and Cardinal Siri became one of Ben Eli's best friends. Ben Eli wrote a couple of books on Cardinal Siri. One of these books is called the Non-Elected Pope, Il Papa Non Eletto, because Siri actually ran as possible Pope for 3 conclaves in a row, actually. Even the conclave when John XXIII was elected had Cardinal Siri among them. By the way, Ben Eli started covering the Vatican, and at that time, there was a press office that was not the Holy See press office that we have now. It was a press office that was attached to L'Osservatore Romano, to the Vatican newspaper. So this press office was actually a room like this big until those desks, not very big. But there were 4/5 journalists. One was Ben Eli for Il Resto del Carlino, and that was sort of revolutionary idea of the editor-in-chief for Il Resto del Carlino. That was Giovanni Spadolini, that later became the president of the Italian Senate, so a very prominent figure in the Italian area. Then there was obviously Associated Press. Then there was Agence France Presse, but he was a guy that was actually an Italian journalist, used to work for both Agence France Presse and other things in Italy. And there was Reuters. So there were just 4 or 5 of them. And it was inside the Vatican. At that time, you could go inside the Vatican as a journalist. Actually, in the place that now there is a store or the backyard of the Vatican Publishing House, at the time there was a bakery. So they used to go there into this room. They used to get the bread, and they used to talk. It was interesting because they could talk to anyone they wanted. No permissions, no nothing like that. What I prefer, this is what I want to show you. So you see this. This is the accreditation of that time. That accreditation, if you check very carefully, is the first accreditation of Ben Eli, is signed by the Sostituto of the Secretary of State of that time. That was Giovan Battista Montini, Paul VI. So the accreditation were made in the Secretary of State by the Sostituto. That's the official, the real one. I have the documents, so that's the real ones. So Ben Eli became my mentor, and that's why I'm telling the story, because that's why I know the story very well. So Ben Eli was the first Vaticanista. Before Ben Eli, no journalist that used to cover the Vatican was called Vaticanista. Then at one point, since he was still looking for what is the Vatican, what I'm doing, he said one day, yeah, I'm a Vaticanista. I'm talking about the Vatican, I'm a Vaticanista. And then this thing took off very, very quickly. And then there was the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council was a sort of turning point. Let me go forward with that. Oh, yeah. No, I had everything in reverse because I'm left-handed, so everything is turned upside down. So that's the first Vaticanista. barely understand how these things works. So what is a Vaticanista? He used this word because he liked to say that he was covering the Vatican. Then after that, he figured one thing. Vaticanista was not as precise as he could think. Why? When Italy took over the pontifical state, it happened that Crispi, that was the leftist prime minister of the so-called historic left, used to call Vaticanisti in a sort of contemptuous way all the people that used to work in the Vatican. Ah, these are the Vaticanisti. Like that. So when Benilai figured, he started to say, well, no, I should call myself a Vaticanologist. And so he started calling himself Vaticanologist. But then, you know how things go. Term took off. And so they went well. Let me check if we can go on with that. Oh, I'm doing the wrong way. So what did the Vaticanist do? Used to live within the Vatican walls, as I said. Well, it's pretty much what I said. I try to. That's the turning point, the Second Vatican Council. What happens with the Second Vatican Council? After Pius XII's death, John XXIII comes. John XXIII announces the Second Vatican Council. At that very moment, the Vatican becomes interesting for everyone in the world, not just for a bunch of newspapers or agencies that have to be there. So with that moment, like 200, 300 people seek for accreditation to the Holy See Press Office that was still Osservatore Romano Press Office. This is a turning point. In that moment, every Italian newspaper started to have a Vaticanista as an official figure. In Italy, most of the big newspapers have a Vaticanista that just deals with Vatican issues. That is broadly religious information, but mostly Vatican. So, Second Vatican Council changes everything, because what happens? Paul VI understands that things have to change. You cannot have 200 people hanging around inside the Vatican, talking to anybody they want. It gets like tricky, because some of these people are in good faith, some of these people are not in good faith. So they move the Holy See Press Office outside the Vatican walls, where it actually is now, and it becomes the Holy See Press Office. It becomes another kind of accreditation that is different. Let me check what's there. So there is new interest, as said, and the interesting is that while they go to the press office, the Vaticanists start to work in pools. So before they worked individually, now they start to work all together, because while the Second Vatican Council debates kept on, most of these people knew nothing about the church. I mean, just think about the reporter from the National Catholic Reporter. He came to Italy, barely knew Italian. What did he do? So they used to meet all together, and they checked things. That's when you start having the groups. Now you see these groups of journalists, but that's when it started. That's a fun story. So they started working in pools, and then, the interest of the church stays on, also because the church gathered a new protagonism. Just think about that. With the council, John XXIII becomes very popular. There is also the solution of the missiles crisis in Cuba. After that, there is the Pacem in Terris. That's an encyclical that is widely read all over the world. So it becomes important to report about these things. It was a glorious moment for the church, I would say. When we speak about these things, we mostly speak about, Vaticanistic, when we speak about communication and curial communication. But when you give me this topic, I started thinking, well, actually, when you think about communication, you have two channels. One is the communication of ourselves as journalists, what we do, what we report about the church. But there is also a communication from the Holy See. It's a two-way thing. What you see there is the cover of the Bollettino. The Bollettino of the Holy See Press Office is what we receive as journalists, since obviously the Holy See Press Office was invented. Now it's done this way, but it had, it was not even that colorful in the 60s, 70s. But this is one of the most recent ones. This thing comes in our emails every day. At least there is one that is always out at noon. The one at noon is the one with the appointments and the agenda of the Pope. So whenever you have a bulletin at noon, you know who the Pope met or who is gonna meet in the afternoon. Sometimes they tell you that. And all the appointments, new bishops, new head of dicasteries, new head of offices, any appointment passes through there. And that's a fun story because the communication of the Holy See Press Office generally changed very much because, as we said, in the beginning was the Secretary of State. With the Curial reform of John Paul II, the Pastor Bonus was still the Secretary of State. Why? Because appointments are papal appointments. So if the papal appointments are papal, it's the papal secretariat that gives you the appointments. It's kind of linear. Very, very. But with the reform, which we've been talking about all this morning, with Predicate Evangelium, we have a difference because we have a dicastery for communication. And this dicastery took over the management of the Holy See Press Office, but not the management of the Bollettino. So we have this, that's the reason why sometimes things come a little stretched out. Because sometimes you have the Secretary of State that has appointments, but they have to pass through the dicastery that has to put them in the Bollettino, and then the Bollettino has to be published. Sometimes things are very trivial. You know, this organization or new organization gets things tricky. Let's go forward. So the communication of the Holy See is what we actually do in the end. But it has two biases generally. You know, we can do it two ways. We can do it like we try to do, as you know, it was mentioned in my presentation. You know, you try to be a Catholic journalist, which does not mean that you have to be Catholic, but Catholic is, you know, the way you are, the principle, which is revolutionary because when you start being a Catholic journalist, it means that you start understanding one big thing about the church. There are no scoops in the Catholic Church. There are no scoops in the Vatican. Whatever happens has a history before. To me, it's very beautiful, but generally it's very discouraging for new journalists because new journalists always look for a scoop. But the issue is that generally, when you see something happening, you have to check all the history of the church and understand if this thing happened before in different ways. For instance, we spoke a lot this morning about synodality. What I've been asking myself for a long time was, synodality is real news for the church? And then you check history. And you see that local synods were celebrated all the time. You know, just think about Archdiocese of Milan had, I don't know how many after St. Charles Borromeo. So there was this synodality in action. Then there were also, you know, what we call synodality is participation. There was participation. Think about the pontifical mission societies. Pontifical mission societies were born in the 19th century by lay people, mostly women, I'm sorry, and then they were taken over by the pontifical, the Holy See, which means that, you know, there was a synodality in action so much that Pauline Jorico, one of the founders of the foundresses of the pontifical mission societies, was so much dear to Pope Leo XIII that Pope Leo XIII wanted her on his side in processions. That's historic. So in the 19th century, you had a woman, lay woman, in procession along with Pope. So if you start thinking that, you know, there are no scoops, but it's nice. I mean, in my view, it's very nice because we have a history, a living history that you can follow. And obviously there are different nuances between popes. Obviously every pope has its difference. And obviously you have to talk a lot about humanity of people. Humanity is one core issue when you start being a journalist because the character of people matters on the decisions they make. The history of a person matters on the decision he makes. So if you don't know the history, if you don't start with that sort of psychological background, which can be, you know, difficult to have, but sometimes it's useful, then you don't understand decisions. You're just blaming something or praising something with no reason. And that's not what you do. You know, you have to give an argument what you do. But the second way is the generally common way, the scandalous way. You just talk about the Holy See, just looking for, you know, the narrow things, corruption, which we spoke about yesterday, or, you know, the failure of human beings, which are always present. I mean, it's not difficult to find failures. It's not difficult to find the mistakes. It's kind of, you know, when you start living the Vatican very, very closely, you find that all the time. Also because something that nobody remembers is that the Vatican is a village. It's a small village of 200 people living there and 2,000–3,000 people working there. Which means that mostly, I've been doing this job for 20 years. After 20 years, you get to know pretty much everyone. as I do, and I'm pretty young for that, but there are people who've been living there for 40 years. More experienced journalists than me, but not only that, more experienced officials at the Vatican and Curial that are there. So we all know the failures of everyone. If you want to tear down somebody, it's kind of easy because we can do it. It's good for revenues, it's good for media, it's very good. It's not the best way because you're not telling the truth, you're telling part of the truth. And obviously you know that the relationship you have with a source is always a strange relationship because a source never tells you all the truth. So they tell you what they want to tell you, which means that you need to accept that you have to trust the people that you know that they will tell you just a part of the truth, but it's the truth. Somebody, you don't need everything, you just need the truth on something. It's a balance. You know, Vatican communication is a balance. Curial communication is even more difficult because Curial communication is mostly based on the specific interests you have and the specific skills you have. Curial communication is about what we talked about, Curial reform this morning. But when we talked about Curial reform, you know, it's because we have a special audience here. And so everybody knows pretty much what we're talking about. But when I go home, I come from a very small town in, you know, southern Italy. And I tell my best friend about Curial reform. First thing he says, what is Curial? Second thing he says, what is reform? Third thing he says, why should I care? Because it's not because that's pretty much the thing. And we talk to people, so we have to explain these things to people. So even for the Curial, you have this twofold situation that is mostly, you know, the communication from the Curial and the communication on the Curial. Communication from the Curial actually has failures in my view. Let me check. I did something. Yeah, that's something we can skip. Yeah. We spoke about also papal communication. And that's another story. Because when you speak about papal communication is even different from the Curial communication and from the Vatican communication. How do the Pope speak? The popes speak. They speak with many things, not only the speeches. See this picture. This picture is when Pope Leo came out. So, beyond what he actually said, what you see, what he's wearing? He's wearing the mozzetta. Mozzetta is this like red mantle here. Did Pope Francis wear that? He didn't. Did Benedict XVI wear that in that same? Yes. So Pope Francis actually never wanted to use the mozzetta, but he restored that. First thing he did was using the mozzetta. That says a lot of things. Mozzetta has been, for many years, considered a sort of symbol of the past temporal power of the Pope. So they said, well, the Pope is white, and then when he wears mozzetta, it's because he wears mozzetta because he's governing. So it's temporal. And that's the prejudice Pope Francis had, which I can understand because he came from South America, which has different institutions, different ways. It's different universal symbols. But in fact, mozzetta was not a symbol of the temporal power of the church. Mozzetta is part of the papal vestments since the very beginning. Popes have never been just white. They've always been white and red. Why? Because they took over the colors of the empire, of the Roman Empire, that Constantine handed them over. So it was red and white. And the symbolism for that was that we passed from the empire of death and war to the civilization of love. This is a new empire based on Jesus Christ. So you see how many things there are in just one thing. I find it beautiful, but it's kind of difficult to explain to people. So when he started wearing that, it was not blaming Pope Francis. That would be stupid to say, but he was saying, well, I get back to this tradition because I understand that we need this language. So it was his way to present himself. So not only the language. First thing he said was, peace be with you. And then he added, is the peace of Christ, which is a very clear message. My message is peace, but it's based on Christ. Like Pope Francis said, buonasera, which was a clear message. I'm here for you. It was a direct contact with people. Everything is to say something. obviously, you know, there are many symbols that you could gather. I just took this, but for example, even when you see, when the Pope had on Sunday the installation mass, and they gave in the fisherman ring and the pallium, every moment of that is a symbol and tells something. For example, the Pope wanted an old-fashioned fisherman ring, which was totally golden. Pope Francis, that had a different universal symbols, because he comes from South America and they have different things to say to people. You know, we need to remember this. He wanted a silver one, just, you know, painted of gold, but it was silver. There are differences. Because with these things, Pope tell what they want to be. This Pope is saying, okay, we had a wonderful experience, we're keeping the good things of the experience, but I still think that the Western tradition, because this is mostly Western tradition, obviously it's not applicable everywhere, but it's Roman Catholic Church, the Roman tradition, let's say, is what we need now, because we have to find a new unity again. So we had this kind of small revolution, now we're back there. This is how the Pope speaks. And then they speak with speeches, obviously, with words, with gestures, also the way they go around the people, the way they, if they kiss or don't kiss a child, it's gesture. For example, this Pope, and that's something we saw, he never wants selfies. He never accepts them, never. Because he says, well, I'm a Pope, so we don't do selfies. We have a photographer, and that's a way to give a dignity. It's not that bad that the other one had selfies, but this one wants to give a different message. And these messages matter. You know, what I'm trying to say is that when you start speaking about Vatican Curial communication, it's always about what message you want to get, what symbols you want to get. And there are many, For example, they said that Benedict XVI used not to communicate very well. I would disagree with that. He had a different way of communication. His communication was books. You know, I mean, you read the 3 books on Jesus of Nazareth that were published during the pontificate, and it was his way of communicating what he wanted. That was, Jesus Christ is the center of our faith, so I published 3 books on Jesus Christ. Let me check what I did there, because I never remember. Curial communication, we were talking about that, so we just skipped that. I want to talk about the Curial reform bias, because the Curial reform bias are interesting. When you have Curial reform, what happened? It happened that this draft of the Curial reform, as Professor this morning explained very well, they were drafted by the Council of Cardinals, then I don't know where they were, and then the Curial reform was published, a kind of impromptu, in March 19, 2022. And there were a lot of issues. Then it was fun because they published the text, but the Curial reform text was actually presented 3 months after, and 2 weeks ahead of the entry into effect, which created a series of bias, because there were news, but nobody explained the news. And that's the thing. You know, you need to explain things. So if journalists have to look after every detail to understand what has changed, and that makes a Vaticanista a sort of, well, they used to say historic of the present. I don't like that, but they have to go in depth very much to understand symbols and check the nuances if they want to do a good job. It's also the other way around. If they want to explain well, they have to explain whatever they do, because otherwise you have bias. For example, we spoke about that yesterday. Why dicasteries are dicasteries and not anymore pontifical councils and congregations? Who explained this to people? They did not. What is the papal canon mission? Why is now every lay people be associated to the mission of the Pope in the Curial? You know, that's something that they had to explain, and they didn't. They just came out with this reform, and that's the big issue. So on one hand, journalists have to study. On the other hand, you have to explain things. We had same issues recently for the pre-conclave meetings before the election on Leo XIV. You might have seen there was a huge debate, at least in the specialistic media, about the reason why they broke the seal of the Pope in the very last day of the congregation, the very last meeting. So they said, why wasn't it broken at the beginning of the sede vacante? Well, the real news was that they showed that they broke. The fact is that they always broke it at the end, because the Constitution says that they have to break it at one point after the beginning of the sede vacante. They don't say when. But they always did at the very last moment, because, for example, in the case of Pope Francis, you had a lot of bishops in foreign countries that, during the hospitalization of the Pope, were ordained bishops, but the bull was not signed because the Pope was hospitalized. So they had to certify the bull somehow. So they had some pending things. But they always did that, it's not news. But they did not explain. Since it was the first time it was showcased, everybody thought, okay, they're tricking us, which is normal, I understand that. And then there was this woman, so I know personally this woman, and so they started to say, yeah, because it's a woman breaking the seals. Yes, but not because it's a woman, because it's the office of calligrapher. And we don't know if before there have been women in the office of calligrapher, recently not, but in this moment, yes. And she was the only one able to do that in the office, because she's the daughter of the former calligrapher, so she was taught by the father. She was the only one able. So when they had to choose somebody in the office to go, said, okay, you come because you're the only one who's able to do that. You know, but nobody explained that. So they just showcased it, and then everything became a scandal, which I totally understand. I had many discussions with cardinals during these days for this reason. So that's the point. So this was pretty much a general overview of what I wanted to tell you. Given the argument, I didn't want to go long, and I hope I did not. I did write 10 characters of Catholic journalists, which I'm not going to read that much because I already explained that, but you can keep it and it will be in my paper. But mostly, what I would like to stress the most, when we speak about Vatican Curial communication, the biggest attitude we should have is what I used to call the epistemological humility. What does it mean? When we approach things from the Vatican, from the religious issues, from the religious information, from the Curial, from the Pope, we need to start over trying to understand what they want to say. We don't have to be judgmental in the beginning, which does not mean that we don't have a judgment afterward. But we need to be humble enough to understand things before. As I told you in the beginning, Benilai was agnostic. He was Catholic by tradition like everybody in Italy, but he barely went to Mass and so on. But then, well, he was my mentor because my chief bureau, when I started this job, was very old. So he told me, you have to go and look for this friend of mine. And so I went to his home, and then I spent a lot of time with him until his death. So I had part of his archive. I have things of him at all, including a report that I never wanted to open because it's a memory, but still. And once I happened to see the piece he wrote for about the beginning of the Second Vatican Council. And it was a piece filled with details in a secular media, secular outlet, very secular one, but filled with liturgical details. And it was like, and the Swiss guards were doing that and not that, and they explained why. And the Pope was wearing this pallium, not the other one, they explained why. And, you know, it was not even, he didn't know anything about that. So I said, yeah, Benny, but, you know, how did you get there? And he said, yeah, because when I go there, I saw that things were different. There was something I had to grasp. So I talked to people and I tried to understand it, to explain to people, because as I was curious, other people were. And that's the epistemological humility. You go there, you try to understand what you're seeing that is not at least usable in the beginning. So the 10 characters go on, I guess, yeah, but now it's about time we stop, I guess. And we can have questions or whatever, yeah, it's time to stop. That's something I was like, we don't have Leo with that still, but we'll have it. But you see, although with differences, Pope always do the same thing at one point. They have to stop to speak. But that's part, you know, that's pretty much what I think about Vatican communication, what I think about Curial communication. And, you know, I think it's very much needed speaking about these issues because during these 2 days, I see that in many cases we have a lot of bias because we come with many issues that, you know, are unresolved somehow. But once you get into the situation, things are, at least they are, how can I say, they are reasonable. Let's say that. Doesn't mean that everything is good. Doesn't mean that everything is perfect. It means that it has a reason. Then we can try to disagree, we can do a lot of things, but that's what a journalist should do, you know. We don't have to claim that we have the truth, but we don't have to stop to look for the truth. And then the floor is open for whatever you want to ask.